Welcome to the session. Today's session is entitled Switch Access to Mobile Technology for Wheelchair Users. The presenter is Emma Smith. She is an occupational therapist and PhD trainee at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Emma's primary interests are in the area of wheelchair and assistive technology, with particular interest in the use of these technologies for individuals with cognitive impairment. Emma's current research focuses on power mobility training techniques for older adults, and she also maintains a small clinical practice primarily addressing switch access for individuals with severe cognitive impairments. In terms of questions that you have, if you have any burning questions during her presentation, you can feel free to ask, but we prefer that she filled the majority of the questions at the end. Thank you, and I give you Emma.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about switch access to mobile technologies for wheelchair users. So generally talking about how we can control someone's entire world with one button and a tablet. So my goal for today is, I know lots of people are feeling overwhelmed by the switch access options that are available for tablet technologies. So I want to take you from the point where you think this is impossible or very challenging to a place where you think it's possible, that it's exciting, and that there's tons of potential in the technology. So I'll go through a little bit about the capabilities of tablet technology, what you're able to accomplish with these devices. I'll then talk very briefly about access options, but I'm going to assume that most people in the room have a general understanding of most access options that are available. Then I'll talk quite substantially about the switch access that's available in iOS and Apple devices, move on to speak a bit about Android devices and some of the options available there, talk a tiny bit about Windows, a little bit about wheelchair integration and mounting, and then we'll go on to questions at the end. So some of you might have been wondering why we're talking about switch access at the International Seating Symposium. And I think one of the key answers is that all of you are sitting here in the room right now, which means that there's a need to be talking about this. I think the reasons are fairly evident. It's a similar population. So a lot of those complex wheelchair users, particularly those using power mobility, they're also switch users, or they also need devices to control their world and their environment. Lots of similar access issues. So all the technologies that we're using to get people access to their drive controls for their power chairs, those issues are also present in switch access for tablets. And also there's great potential for integration. So those people who are using power devices, we're able to integrate the access that they have for their power wheelchair into the access that they have for their tablet technology. And of course, in terms of a holistic approach, if we consider switch access in the beginning and consider all of the uses in their world and the day-to-day things that they need to do, we're going to have a better outcome. So looking at them together is going to be really important. So tablet technologies are everywhere. We're seeing not just tablets, but phones as well. Lots of mobile technologies are on the market, and lots of people have them in their pockets or in their bags. And they have lots of capabilities. For this particular population, we're looking at things like everyday computing, so your email, your Facebook, social media, word processing, those kinds of things. For this population, we're also looking at communication, so that augmentative communication and the speech-generating devices, we're seeing much more integration into the tablets and mobile technology for those. We also see lots of environmental control. So we have people that are able to control the light switches in their homes, their automatic door openers, even there are pressure cookers that you can now control from your tablet. So we're starting to see a huge range in terms of environmental control and home automation being controlled through tablets. And we're also seeing a building world of health monitoring devices. So the ability to monitor your health on an ongoing basis with the device that you have available to you and that you might own already. So huge potential, and particularly for this population. So for those of you who have tablets, most of you probably use them through a touch interface. It's really the primary mode of access that they were designed for in the beginning, but we're really starting to see them branch out. We've seen great strides in voice access and voice activation on all these technologies, and with every new iteration of the technologies, you see better access through voice. We're also seeing better access through Switch, and that's what we're talking about today. And then for some tablets, we also have access through a mouse or an alternative to a mouse or a similar device. So each of those has their place, and I'm going to talk about where each of them fits as we go throughout the presentation today. So Switch access, and at this point I'm still talking across all of the platforms, whether it's Android, Apple, or Windows. We're looking at issues of single or multiple switch use. So there are ways to control these devices with just one switch, but there's also ways to control them with multiple. So we'll talk a little bit about that. There's also a wide variety of switches. So basically anything that your clients are using on the market in terms of switch access, we can probably integrate it into a tablet device with a little bit of work. Of course, ideally, the use that the person has depends on their capabilities, but also what they're intending to use the tablet for. So each of the tablets has different capacities, and each one will be more beneficial for a certain type of person. And then in terms of the actual options for using the device, we've got item scanning, single item scanning, or row column. And then there's also cross-scanning capacity. There's also some auditory scans available, and I'll bring them up as we go through, but still they typically fall under either the item scanning or the cross-scanning. So just out of curiosity, how many in this room have an iPhone or an iPad? Okay. And how many have an Android device? How many of you have actually tried to do switch control on iOS? Okay. And what about Android? Have any of you tried it on Android? So not as many. And how many of you, when you did try it, found it overwhelming or frustrating or difficult or confusing and hard to use? Yeah, that's what I hear a lot, is that people are finding this is really difficult and complex, and I think that we can get to a point where it's not, so we just have to work at it. Anybody feel really, really comfortable using these devices for switch access, and it's no problem at all? Just one? Excellent. So the challenge, we're going to start with iOS, and so Apple devices. The challenge with iOS is that there's a high level of complexity, and what that means to me is that we have huge potential. So there's lots of options available, but that means we can do lots with it. It's very powerful in terms of what it can do if you harness the power of it. And I like to say that we are going to follow the KISS principle on this. So keep it simple, stupid. We want to make sure it's really simple from the beginning, and we're not going to have any trouble with it in the long term. It doesn't have to be complex as long as you understand it, and it doesn't have to be difficult. You can also start with iOS more simple and take it to more complex. So you can really do a progression as the person you're working with learns. So I'm going to show you a quick video for those of you who don't know what iOS looks like out of the box in terms of switch access. You'll see I've simplified my screen. Oh. So I've simplified the home screen here. This is a row column scan in iOS. So it's just highlighting each of the individual items, and then when you select a row, it will select. It then brings you into a menu screen, and then it takes you into further menus. And each of those menus gets deeper and deeper. So you'll see here I'm going to go into the gestures, and it gets even more complex. So all of these options are available, and it can be really overwhelming, particularly for a clinician who's just learning the process, or for a client who's getting stuck in these menus and then they don't know how to get out. They don't know how to get back to their home, and they don't know what to do. So very, very frustrating process for someone when it's still in all of these, has all of these options. So in terms of what iOS has available for switch control, it's updated from iOS 8. So we first had access through VoiceOver, which was originally built for visual impairment. And I think that a lot of the world thinks accessibility and they think visual impairment first, but for the people that need help with physical access, they didn't really get there yet. And so we started with VoiceOver, which was built for visual impairment, And we kind of co-opted it to use it for physical impairment, but it didn't work that well. And then when iOS 7 came out, they actually released a switch control program. And then with iOS 8, they actually simplified pieces of the menu, but they changed it quite substantially in terms of the layers. And the current iteration is quite a bit better to work with. Switch control for iOS can be controlled through Bluetooth or a wired switch. It can be controlled with the head, although that's still tenuous. It's not always very reliable. And it can also be controlled by a tap on the full screen. So for somebody who might have some physical access and they might not have great precision, they can use the screen as a switch with no additional hardware. Or for somebody learning, if you don't want to buy an interface, you can always use the screen to learn, and it's a great tool for a clinician who maybe has access to a device but doesn't have an interface. Everything's programmable through the main menu, and you can do either scanning through row and column, or you can do point scanning, which is more of a cross scanner. You can do it with or without VoiceOver, and in iOS 8, they actually brought out an auditory cue that can come along with the switch access. And there's lots of adjustments, and I'm going to talk you through some of those adjustments as we go, but there are things like speed, how long you have to hold in order to activate the switch, whether it repeats, how long you hold until you release, lots and lots of different options. In terms of interfaces that we're using, there's wireless and wired interfaces. Lots available on the market now, especially in the last year or two. Some of the benefits of using a wireless interface is that you can continue to charge the device while you're using the switch. So for somebody who's using the device over a long period of time, over the course of a day, having access to continue to charge your device is critical. So that's a great benefit of a wireless interface. Unfortunately, they also require batteries or charging. So it's another thing that you have to plug in and another thing that you have to charge. And sometimes they lose their pairing. So they might need to be paired, or someone in the environment needs to know how to pair them if they do lose the pairing. The alternate is to have a wired interface. Those are great because they don't need to be charged. They just plug right into the device, and you have no challenges with pairing, but then you do have the trouble of not being able to charge your device while your switch is plugged in. So there are benefits to both, and it really depends on what your client needs as you're going. So to begin with thinking about how we simplify all those menus and the challenge of iOS, the first thing that I always like people to do is set up an accessibility shortcut. So if you go into your settings, your accessibility settings, at the very, very bottom, hidden where you can't see it, there's this great little thing called accessibility shortcut, and it changes your triple click of your home button. So lots of you are probably familiar with a double click. If you do a triple click, you can actually activate certain accessibility settings, and one of those settings is switch control. And what I love about this is you can activate your switch control with a triple click, and then when you're done with switch control, you deactivate it with the same triple click. So if you're using the full screen as a switch and you don't have access to any of the screen controls, you're not going to get stuck in switch control. You can always turn it off. So especially for caregivers or clinicians who want quick access to turn the system on and off, setting that accessibility shortcut is really critical. And I think it really improves ease of use, and it reduces frustration quite substantially. So iOS switch options, the list is long. The first thing that it looks at is switches and actually setting up your switches. You can set up as many switches as you want. There are only a certain number of options, so you can't really exceed that. The next option that you can turn on and off is auto scanning. So looking at whether it's going to scan automatically through all of the options, or whether the person is going to advance independently and make the choice to advance through the switch options. There's a whole number of settings around timing. So how long it takes for auto scanning to complete, how fast it goes, whether it pauses on the first item before it moves on to the next. And for people who need to get their heads around, okay, now I'm starting switch scanning, that pause is sometimes critical. How many loops it does. For someone who might take a while, they might want 3 or 4 loops. For someone who's very quick, they might only want 1 because they don't need it to repeat every time. Move repeat is another where whether or not you repeat a move, whether it's going to activate the second time that you hit it or not, so that you don't necessarily have to keep hitting the same switch. There's then issues around switch stabilization. So how long you need to hold the switch in order for it to activate, and then an ignore repeat. So it will ignore a repeated input so that you don't have the same input over and over and over again. So there's a short video here on how we add switches. So we go into Bluetooth first if you're using a Bluetooth switch, and you make sure that you're connected to your specific switch that you're using. And so it's hard to see because you can't see a mouse action on here, but I've connected here on the pedal. And then you go into your accessibility settings and down to switch control. Of course, it's not near the top. And go into your switches. And then it's as simple as adding a new switch. And you choose an external switch or a screen or the camera. And then you activate the switch. And it asks you to give it a name. So you give it any name you want, and then it asks what you want the switch to do. So you select what you want the switch to do, and then you can go on and add a second switch. And like I said, you can add as many switches as actions are available. So in this case, there's lots of actions that you can do with a switch. So you can set a switch to just do a tap. It can bring up Siri. It can go back to the home button. Lots of different options that you can choose. So in terms of other settings that you can look at, you can turn on point scanning. And point scanning is like, if you're familiar with a Windows environment and switch access, it's a crosshair type of scanning. And for this one, the only setting that they ask you to choose is how fast you want the cursor gliding across the screen to go. You can also look at some of the audio settings, so sound effects, whether you want the sound effects to play. They tend to be quite annoying, but if you have somebody who needs the audio input to know that the switch has moved from one point to the next, sound effects can be quite useful. And then speeches to allow you to have an auditory scan. There's also this great little feature called included menu items, and I think this is where the majority of the simplification can happen. This allows you to specify when that menu comes up, when you tap something, what you include in that menu. So you can minimize it completely so you don't include much at all, and it really simplifies the process of accessing what you need to on your screen. You can also group items, so it takes it from a simple individual item scan to a row column scan and can speed up the process of scanning to get through. And then you can change some of the visual features. So there's the option for a large cursor and the option to change cursor color. I always think that the large cursor is better no matter who you're working with. It's way easier to see, and I use it on all of my devices. The cursor color, I tend to choose red as it seems to have good contrast, but for someone who needed another color contrast, there are 5 color options. So you're able to choose your cursor color to get good contrast. So in iOS item scanning, it actually selects item by item, and it goes either through the individual items or by row and column. And item scanning is really beneficial for apps that have very discrete buttons. So an app that tends to be simpler and has discrete areas that you want to choose, it tends to be best. So item scanning really thrives in things like this communication system, where the buttons are very discrete. So you'll see the scanner here coming through, and it's going to go through each of the rows, and then it chooses the column. And as you choose things, they'll show up in the top. But as you see, each of these are very discrete buttons. So there's nothing unusual that you're trying to find. There's no precision that you need. So it really thrives in this kind of environment. So the alternate to item scanning is point scanning. And iOS will actually choose point scanning for you if it gets into an environment where item scanning doesn't work. So you can choose to have it on your own, or iOS will make the choice when it gets into, say, a very complex website. It's a cross-scanning, so it crosses from, it goes from top to bottom first, and then left to right on the screen, and you can pinpoint an exact point on the screen where you want to have a touch input. It's great for use for improved precision, or for apps that really don't fit that mold of having very discrete items. So one of the apps that I like to show this with is actually the BBC website. It needs a lot of precision in order to work. So you can come across the screen, and then it allows you to get even more precise. And then you finally get down to a point where you get to pinpoint exactly where you want to touch, and it opens it for you. So it can be very good for those complex websites. It tends to be good for people who have a bit more in terms of cognitive impairment, so they can get that less cognitive impairment, so they can get that precision. So like I said, the other piece of simplifying iOS is grouping menu items and how many menu items you're actually going to include in the menu when they hit the switch. I like to take it down to none to start, so give someone just the tap. The challenge with that is that you can't get back to the home screen if you're a single switch user. So you need the menu to get back to the home screen. If you have a potential for a dual switch, you can set one switch as tap and one switch as home. And that's the simplest you can go with 2 switches, really. And then for a single switch user, either it can be assisted by a caregiver or you can have just the home button as your second menu item. So you start small, tap only, then you might move to tap and home, then you might add scroll, and you can add things as you go, but you don't have to add it all at once. So I showed you in the beginning what the more complex looks like. So now, I'll show you what that more simple solution looks like. So now when you go through the items, it's still going to scan in the same way, but when you select, it's going to select without actually giving you a menu. So it's just going to tap as though you tapped it with your finger. And then as you go into an app, and this is an app I really like for music because it's so discrete in terms of buttons and the switch scanning works really well, it goes through all the buttons, and whatever you hit, it just taps and it causes the action. And then I have this set up in this one for 2 switch scan. So at this point, then you could hit your home button and it would take you back to the home screen. The name of it is escaping me right now, but I will remember it later and I will let you know. Oh, it's called Stezza, S-T-E-Z-Z-A. It's the best music app I've found, without a doubt. So why would you choose iOS at the end of the day? One of the great benefits of iOS is that it has great compatibility with existing environmental controls. Pretty much every company that's done environmental control or home automation, they've done it for iOS or they've done a version for it. And they're also building in a new, more integrated program called HomeKit, which is going to integrate all those existing controls into iOS. So really great compatibility. It's also great for communication apps. There's a ton on the market now, and some of the big players have brought in communication apps. They're not cheap. Some range up to about $200 or $300, but it's better than paying $15,000 for a dedicated communication device in a lot of cases. So those communication devices are great on iOS. There's also the fact that it's really mainstream. So the likelihood that your caregiver or the family member, the parent, the daughter, the son, that they have one of these devices already or that they're familiar with the interface, huge likelihood. So it diminishes the teaching and training you might have to do in terms of dealing with family members. And for kids and teens, there's an added cool factor. So if they're going to school and they have their tablet instead of their big bulky communication device or whatever else they're using, it gives that added cool factor for them. The nice benefit for me as well is that there's the potential to increase the complexity as you get more familiar. And it's also remarkably consistent. It's consistent between devices, so you can use a phone one day and you can use a tablet the next. But also, it's where Android, you can have multiple different devices that you might need to be familiar with how all of them operate. In iOS, you're only going to be dealing with either an iPad or an iPhone. So who might it work for in terms of a case study? One great example would be a teen with cerebral palsy who wants to be as normal as possible. Great, let's give them an iPad. Lots of their peers probably have one and they're going to be able to use it. Also someone who may have multiple switch sites. So if you can get those multiple actions going, iOS is going to be great because each access point can have a discrete action. You can have one access point that's devoted specifically to something like Siri. If this person's got a communication device, like I said, it's a great tool for that. And it gives you the capacity to control things like your music, your camera, communication, and also things like social media, like your Facebook. So a great solution for this person would be multiple switch control using 2 or more switches, setting your first switch to only do scan and select with a very simplified menu, and your second switch as home. For someone a little different, looking at an adult who has quadriplegia, and there's someone that I've worked with recently who I based this case study off of. He's a sip and puff driver, so he is operating his wheelchair independently, but he actually does have head control as well, and doesn't want his sip and puff system to also drive his tablet. He wants them separate. So we've done it as a head switch instead. He's got 2 switch access sites because he can do a head switch on either side. He does have a mode switch on one side for his wheelchair, but we're able to get past that. He's also cognitively intact and very aware, really quick learner. And his prime focus was having access to his email, setting calendar appointments, getting access to his browser, and integrating it with his computer. And he had a Mac, so integrating iOS with his Mac was really easy. So for him, we did a 2-switch control as well. We did, at the head, 2 switch sites. One was scan and select, and we simplified the menu so he didn't have to do lots of other things, although we kept in a scroll because he's often going through web pages. And the second, we actually used the switch as Siri activation so that he can set things with Siri. He can say, Siri, I'd like to set an appointment for 2 p.m. on Tuesday, and it goes into his calendar automatically. So he doesn't have to go through all those switch setups to get to that. He can just use Siri for what Siri's useful for, and he can use switch access for the rest of it. Any questions on iOS quickly? Any burning questions? I'll have some time at the end, but just in case before we move on. Yeah? So the question was, if you use more than 2 switches, where do they connect? So are you asking in terms of an interface?
Yeah, if it's like something like a Bluetooth, there's only spots for 2 switches.
Yeah, so Bluetooth interface does only have 2 switch access points, but something like the Zybox has 6, so you're able to get more input with something like a Zybox. Yeah. So on the Android side of things, Android has very recently integrated switch access in their new Lollipop system. It's really new, and I can't stress that enough, how new Android switch access is. It's in accessibility and settings. It is very limited, and I think a lot of that is due to its newness, and it will probably improve with time. And there are some challenges with it. I find it difficult to see, and if I'm finding it difficult, then that makes it almost certain that my clients will. And it's limited in terms of what it can do with a single switch. There are some benefits to using Android, no doubt. One is that you can have switch-specific apps which do their entire own thing in terms of switch access, and they don't rely on the switch system that Android has built in. So there's one that I'll show you that does this particularly well. There's also the potential for mouse use with Bluetooth connection. So for anybody who's driving a power chair anyway and can use a joystick mouse emulator, you can actually transfer that onto your Android and get through the system with a mouse. So that's a potential that iOS doesn't have. And Android also allows us to use what's called launchers to simplify things. So a launcher takes the place of your home screen and allows you to bypass any complexities of your home screen altogether. And I'll show you one of those as we go. So in Android switch options, very limited. There's an option for auto scan. You can turn it on or off. That allows you to either let it scan automatically or to choose your next and your select. And then you can set your switches. And these are pretty much all the options you have. So the list is here in terms of what options you can set for each individual switch. And you can set individual Bluetooth switches that connect for each of these options. In terms of Android interfaces, again, we're looking at both wired and wireless. For those of you who might have an Android device or have one to play with at some point, and you don't have an interface, a really great tip that I learned last year was you can actually take a headphone set that has a button on it. So any headphone set that's got a microphone usually has a button, and you can plug it into headphone jack, and that button can act as a switch. So if you're learning the process of dealing with Android, using that button as a switch is a cheap way to figure it out. You can also wire in a head mouse to an Android through a USB dongle, so it's an option that's not available in other devices, or at least in iOS. In terms of wireless access, you can set a keyboard to be your switch, so it could be any key on a keyboard. Komodo Labs has what's called a Tekla, and there is one available for iOS as well, but it's primarily used in Android. There's Bluetooth interfaces like there are in iOS. And then, like I said, you can also use a mouse or a joystick through Bluetooth emulation. So lots of options. So the Android switch settings are here. And when you go into settings, it's very small. There's a little point called accessibility, and you turn switch access on or off in this menu. And then once it's on, you can go back to settings, and then you can set your key combinations. So you just choose the key or the action that you want, and then you press the key that you want to activate that action, and it automatically sets it for you. So in terms of a visual interface, it's difficult to see. I don't know if you guys can see on the second row there, the second one in, there's a small green box around that icon. That's the total of what you get to tell you where you are on the switch interface. So it's very difficult to see. They don't group items, so it can be slow and a little cumbersome. Sometimes it doesn't always get your activation when you hit your switch, so it can be a little hit and miss. But like I said earlier, it's still early on. I think it was only released in November, so there's lots of learning to do, and with the next update, hopefully we'll see lots of changes. So I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this, but this is the home screen, and it's selecting each individual item with the green box around it. So as you see, there's no row column, and it just goes through each item. Then what it does is a very funny thing. It pops back up to the top before it goes down to the very bottom. So it goes up to the Google search bar before it goes down to your home screen icons. And for most people, those icons in the bottom are the ones they use most regularly. So you kind of need to switch it around to make it work for you. And then it brings up these 5 options, which is basically to go back or home or to some of the more recent applications that you've used. So those come at the end. So it can be quite long if you did something wrong to get to where you need to be to go back. So one of the ways that we can simplify Android is through launchers. So these take the place of your home screen. So every time that you open up your device, this is what's going to show up instead of the home screen. And you can select what those icons are. And there's lots of different companies making launchers. They're actually apps, but they integrate within the system really well. So these are great visual interfaces for people who maybe really need a more simplified visual interface in front of them. And there are free and paid versions. So the one you're looking at now, they have both a free and a paid version, and they're fully customizable. So when you look at this, the switch access is going to look the same coming through it. It's that green bar. And on this one, there's almost no contrast, so you can't hardly see it at all. But it does go through each of them and then brings you back to that menu at the end. So like I said, sometimes with Android, there are specific apps that do switch access really well. And there's one app coming out of Ireland right now called Click2Go. And it's actually a full system with also a device called Housemate. And it works within an Android environment. And it's a very simplified, customizable interface that has its own switch access settings. So you don't have to use the Android stuff. You use theirs. And it still brings in the switches via Bluetooth or a wired connection. Lots of switch options in this, as well as integrated environmental controls, which is nice. It also has its own little communication interface, so you can do some text-to-speech work. It's not quite as robust as the apps that you might get, but it does have something. But if you want full access to the app, you actually have to have their Housemate device. So that you can sort of play with it without the Housemate device, but you do need it if you want full access. So looking at the Click2Go system, they have a nice setup wizard, which I really like. It warns you that you're going to change some settings, and it gives you lots of options in terms of whether you're a beginner or not. It also gives you all the home page options and whether you want them shown as a list or a grid, and what kind of theme you want for the visuals, then how you're going to scan and what device you're going to use. So you'll see the Bluetooth actually is in that list because it does accommodate the Bluetooth, as well as the headset switch that I talked about. It gives you some timing options and then asks you to pair your hardware. So then you can ask to pair now or postpone. You can choose the headset switch to play with it, like I said. And then it will go back to your home screen, and this is what it looks like. If your hardware is not connecting, this is the warning that you'll get. So I had a headset switch plugged into it, but it wasn't getting anything through Bluetooth. So it's got good contrast, and it goes through all of the options for you, and that bright green is really easy to see. And it does row column scanning, so very different from what it looks like on Android in general. So when you're actually using Click2Go, it doesn't go to outside apps. It uses its own built-in apps. So it does the row column scan, and then we're going to go down to camera here. And it goes into the camera, so you see it's its own camera app. It doesn't actually go to the Android camera app. And it allows you to take a picture with one switch hit, nice and easy. And then there's a way to go back to the home screen. So this is actually great for a single switch user, whereas the rest of the Android work isn't quite so good. So why might you choose Android? It definitely has easy simplification if you go to something like a launcher, and that's something you never have in iOS. You can't change the size of your icons. You can't do anything like that in terms of simplifying your home screen. Android will always allow you to do that in a way that iOS doesn't. It gives you access to that all-in-one solution as a result. Something like Click2Go and Housemate really give you a packaged solution. There's also much greater potential for app development in Android, so it's not so terribly controlled by Apple in the way that the iOS devices are. So you can have a developer develop an app just for one person, and you can put it onto their device without issue, and it doesn't have to go through the App Store and everything. There's also a cost implication. They are cheaper. So there's lots of Android devices on the market, which means you have tons of choice, and you can choose a cheaper device or a more expensive device, but it's up to you and your client. And I think a huge benefit of Android that tends to be overlooked is that potential for mouse integration, particularly for independent joystick users who are able to use that joystick to actually get access to their device. So who might we be using with? If you look at someone who might be, say, a senior who has Parkinson's and as a result has limited mobility, and as they get more severely affected by the Parkinson's, the precision to use those touch interfaces might be less desirable. They may have some difficulty learning if there's some cognitive impairment associated with it, and if they're on a limited income. And they may need something that's easy communication with their kids. They want to be able to text to their kids. They want to be able to send an email or send a photograph of where they are. So they want that easy communication option. So a solution for them would be an Android device with a single switch or multiple switches. And in this case, this is where I think a launcher is really beneficial for simplification. So bringing it down to exactly what they need and no more, and they never have access to the settings. Another option would be a teenager who has muscular dystrophy and therefore limited strength. One that I worked with who had quite spectacularly good cognitive awareness, which isn't unusual, but was driving with a micro joystick on their wheelchair, and it worked really well for them driving their chair, so we knew we had a really solid access point, and they can do mouse emulation through that wheelchair into the Android. So it gives them full access to the Android without having to have a big laptop or a computer with them. Also, for this kid who was interested in programming, it kind of gave a goal for them developing something that would work for them. So the solution for them was an Android with mouse emulation and getting into that system and being able to move about entirely independently. No switches, we could integrate it with the current wheelchair setup and just move forward from there. So nice and simple and a really cost-effective alternative. So then the third option, sorry, before I go on, any Android questions quickly? Yeah. With the joystick, you can do a press on the joystick or a specific movement that will cause the joystick to select. Sorry, the question was if there's no switches, how do they select? And you can set that up with a specific movement. Yeah. So the other option is the Windows Surface tablet. This is an interesting one because it's an environment that many people are already familiar with. So it's the only tablet right now that has built-in USB access without a separate device to give you access to the USB, which means that you can plug something like a head mouse into it without issue, or a Swifty that you might be familiar with using on a Windows-based PC. You can also use existing Windows software, so something like Dragger or Cross Scanner that you might have used before, that can be used on that Windows Surface tablet as well. So I'm not going into a lot of what the options are because this is more so along the lines of what you might have already been familiar with in terms of using. But an example of someone this might be really good for would be an older adult who maybe has C5, quadriplegia, spinal cord injury a long time ago. They need an updated device, but they're really used to a Windows interface, and it's what they've been using their entire life. They've got good switch access to it. And as a proficient Dragon user who's familiar with that, they might be able to use that on their Windows device in the same way. As well, being a head mouse user, it gives them the access to the device in the same way that they're used to using it, and they don't have to make any shifts, or they don't have to learn a new system. So then it brings us to the question of mounting. Once you've got this device and you've got your setup and you know how you're going to access it, what are you going to do with it? So there are lots of options available now, particularly as we get more and more tablets on the market. The great benefit of a tablet is that it's lightweight, so you're not dealing with a 15-pound device. You're dealing with a much smaller device that's not going to put as big a strain on a mounting system. You also have screens that will deal with light adjustment. So if you get into a brighter situation, it will change the contrast on the screen for you, and it will do it all automatically, which means that the positioning of your device becomes a little less critical, especially if they're not using a direct access or a touch access, because you can push it off to the side in a way, and they can still get access from a visual perspective. So there's multiple mounting options. There's lots available commercially and off the shelf, but then there's also the custom options available. So if you're down in the exhibit hall, you'll see lots of tablet mounting options around, and all of them are great. And some are adjustable that you can kind of have in your toolkit if you're going around and working with lots of different people, and then there's some that are more specific. And then there's wheelchair integration. And I'm not going to talk at length about this either, because there are a few other sessions this week that are going to go into that. But there are Bluetooth emulators for mouse access that you can get through some of the wheelchair systems. You can also get some Bluetooth switch input, although they tend to fight with iOS in a way that they don't fight with Android, so another point for the Android systems. There's iPortal from Dynamic Controls, and that actually controls a very specific app that is available on iOS, and it can control some of the functions that you might need. And then any hardwired switch that you have built into the system can be plugged into a Bluetooth interface. So there's multiple ways to integrate. Honestly, at this point, iOS has the most limited integration with wheelchairs, but I'm really hoping that that comes soon. So where I look forward in terms of the future and some of the directions that we'd like to take this, it would be really great if we could have some improvement in terms of the integration with iOS and the wheelchair access. So it's not there yet, but it is hopefully coming, and I know that the developers are working on it, but it's hard to get into the iOS system. It's pretty locked down by Apple, so you have to do a lot of work to get there. It would be really great if Android could bring their switch systems along so that we can all have better access on all devices. And also another one, and I think it was well illustrated with the music app, considering a switch access in app design. So anybody that works with any developers who are doing apps, make sure they think about this while they're doing it, that discrete buttons make a huge difference. It would also be lovely if iOS would bring in some kind of launching system where you could replace your home screen with a simplified launcher, because right now Android has the option, but iOS doesn't. And better cross-platform communication. So right now we don't have great cross-platform communication, and it would be great if that would be better integrated. And of course, more training and education, because I know there's lots of people that are wanting to get access to this, but they don't have good training available in their area for teaching a group of clinicians or a group of distributors how they can actually use these devices and optimize their use for their clients. And then some of the resources that you might want access to. AbleNet has produced an iOS switch guide, which is primarily featuring AbleNet products in terms of the Bluetooth switch and how you can access that way. I've written a switch access guide as well, which is the second one on the list there. It's on my website, but only for, it's iOS 7 at the moment, so I'm working on upgrading it to iOS 8, but a lot of the principles are still the same, so I'm getting there. RJ Cooper's website has a number of resources as well, and then there's lots of YouTube videos, so Switch users have actually been taking it upon themselves to make videos of them doing things and upload them to YouTube, and they're a really great resource for when you're trying to get through some of those more sticky situations. Are there any questions?
questions, and I'll launch both of them. In the iOS, you were showing in the scanning there was a nice, bright, big box. Can you adjust the thickness of the lines and the colors in the scanning? And the second question would be, with your apparent experience in AAC software packages, which ones might be best on an iPad, for example, with switch access?
Sure. So in the first question, in terms of in iOS, the box that you're looking at that surrounds each of the icons, you can change the thickness and the color. It's all available in the switch options in the visual interface. And there's, I think there's 5 switch color options. And I use the thicker interface always. I think the thinner one is just frankly a little silly. And then your second question was around AAC, certain AAC apps. The one I showed you was TouchChat HD, and that one actually has tons and tons of options and is really well seen on a screen, and it has great discrete boxes that switch access picks up without any issue at all. And for somebody who might be using a text editor or just a simple speech generating, I've had great success with both predictable and verbally. So they both pick up really well, and the keyboards work well with switch access as well. Yeah? There are ways to do it. It just depends on the app you use. So a lot of the apps are poorly designed in terms of, in terms of the environmental control side of things, the apps are specific to the physical hardware device that you're using. So there was a really great device that's no longer available called the Gear 4, which had a really good interface, and switch access used it without issue. That was the best that I've found. Unfortunately, they're no longer making it. My general go-to in that case is to move to point scanning, because the app doesn't have that great individual item scan, but it is so dependent on the individual app. Yeah, it's a challenge. Yeah. I have no idea. I'm really sad. Gear 4 was like the best thing that I thought was on the market. I still have one in my house, but I don't know where it is. It's gone. Yeah. Are there any? Yeah. That's a really good question. You guys probably didn't hear it at the back. The question was, given that our devices are so useful, how come we're not driving chairs with them and using them as the interface to drive chairs and going the other way around? I haven't heard any rumblings myself. I don't know if anyone in the audience from a manufacturer side has heard. Anybody know if they're going to move that way? Yeah? Yeah, certainly a challenge. Yeah, there are definitely more touch screens coming onto the market, but it doesn't solve the problem necessarily for a Switch user, and it certainly doesn't do what you're asking. But I take the point about it being a medical device fairly seriously. I know how hard it is to get a device through FDA approval to try to get to a point where it can be distributed, and we wouldn't want Apple. It would also increase the cost quite substantially, I think, to try to have to go through a mainstream device. At least right now, they're somewhat cheap. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Thanks very much, guys. And if anybody wants to come up and speak with me, I'll be at the front.